What is the Covering Climate Now coalition? It has the slogan, "Good journalism is grounded in science." Well, hard to argue with that in principle. And it says, therefore, we have a responsibility to get the climate story right. It's an important issue, so we should definitely try and do that. So is it just promoting good journalism? Is it promoting good science? And how should journalists talk about climate change? Well, it turns out these are harder questions than you'd think. So let's have a look. The Covering Climate Now initiative is a media partnership that seeks to influence how climate change is reported. It boasts more than 460 different media outlets, together reflecting a reach to 2 billion people. With those stats, they argue that they have significant influence, and we should believe them. It was co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation, in association with The Guardian and WNYC. And it says that its partners include some of the biggest names in news. In addition to 3 of the world's biggest news agencies, Reuters, Bloomberg and Agence France-Presse, each of which provides content to thousands of other newsrooms, our partners include CBS News, NBC and MSNBC News, Noticias Telemundo, PBS NewsHour, Univision, Al Jazeera, most of the biggest public radio stations in the US, many flagship newspapers and TV networks in the Americas, Europe and Asia, and dozens of leading magazines and journals, including Nature, Scientific American, Rolling Stone, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, and Mother Jones. With such a powerful coalition, it's worth looking at what they say. And they've laid it all out. 10 best practices that they want their partners, and frankly everyone else, to follow. Well, let's unpick those in order. Number 1, say yes to the science. There are not two sides to a fact. For too long, especially in the US, the media juxtaposed climate science, a matter of overwhelming global consensus, with climate skepticism and denialism, seldom more than thinly veiled protections of the fossil fuel industry. And straight away we're into tricky territory because we're making such broad generalizations. So look, it's true. There is a large degree of scientific agreement about the core principles of recent climate change. And it's a demonstrable fact that certain institutions, some associated with certain fossil fuel interests, have used well-known techniques to deliberately try to create confusion and misinformation. That much is true. But you then have to be pretty specific. Saying yes to the science is to recognise that there are those core aspects where there's little serious dispute, and there are then a number of others, many of which are amplified by campaigners, which are well removed from any sort of consensus. Indeed, are sometimes rank outlier opinions not supported by the majority. The immediate danger from a statement like this is that in framing a perfectly valid concern, not to fall for deliberate misinformation, you end up enshrining a particular view as the orthodoxy that cannot be challenged. And it goes on like this. As journalists, we must write about climate change with the same clarity of the scientists who have been sounding the alarms for decades. A number of those scientists argue pretty vigorously between each other around the details of some of those issues, it's worth noting. Some of the campaigners' favourite messages, for instance that we're in a 6th mass extinction, that framing is not agreed by scientists. And some of the mainstream institutions like IPBES that deal with species extinctions, they do not promote that message accordingly. But in this view, there are just the scientists sounding the alarm and detractors who seek to mislead the public. That may be how campaigners see the world. It's not fully reflective of the state or the process of science, where you actually have to evaluate the quality of the contributions. All right, let's move on. Number 2. The climate crisis is a story for every beat. At its core, the climate story is a science story, but whether you cover business, health, housing, education, food, national security, entertainment or something else, there is always a strong climate angle to be found. It's down to every media outlet to decide what their editorial priorities are. I mean, it's absolutely their right. Personally, I think that is really bad advice. if you are constantly banging on about something over and over and over, I think that turns most people off. Campaigners certainly fail to realise that people don't share their obsessions, but this is meant to be aimed at journalists, not campaigners, right? Plus, if a pandemic taught us anything, it's the fact that the next crisis can come from anywhere. If you're making an inflexible rule that whatever you're talking about, it has to be focused on climate, you're giving up your ability to detect emerging issues because you're running your information through a very active filter. But they do at least have advice to make it engaging. Journalists should be sure to emphasise the human side of the climate story. For political reporters, for example, Biden's climate agenda obviously deserves coverage, but audiences will likely be more engaged by stories that start with how the climate emergency is seen and felt by ordinary people, and then discuss how government policy can make a difference. Well, that's a telling example. You see, I would expect a journalist would ask questions like, does Biden's climate agenda stand up to scrutiny? Is it well-designed policy? Which people are going to lose out as a result of this policy? Those are the sorts of questions journalists ask, or at least used to ask, about every policy proposal. Does the opposition, official or otherwise, have an important critique? Do they have an alternative plan? It's the standard stuff of politics. You see, with the first section, you could make the case, albeit that you're open to definitional problems, that elements of the science shouldn't be artificially subjected to everything has two sides. I mean, with difficulty, but you can make that case. You can't do that with politics. Policy proposals should always be subjected to critical scrutiny. This paragraph seems to suggest that the journalist's obligation is to sell Biden's climate agenda, not to report on it. That conflates taking the issue seriously with campaigning for one version of what you do about it. That is not the job of journalism as I understand it, and if it becomes the job of journalism, we need a new journalism. I mean, sure, you get partisan media outlets who make their affiliation part of their explicit identity, but that doesn't apply to most of the partners of this organisation. It finishes this section saying this. In the words of renowned climate author Bill McKibben, climate change is an exciting story filled with drama and conflict. It's what journalism was made for. Well, maybe, but you just said we're not allowed to talk about the conflict part. And describing Bill McKibben as a renowned climate author makes him sound like a scientific author. He is, of course, an environmentalist campaigner. There's nothing wrong with that. Good luck to him. You shouldn't get it confused with your jobs as journalists. I mean, should you? All right, next section. 3. Emphasise the experiences and activism of the poor communities of colour and Indigenous people. Environmental justice is key to the climate story. So that is explicitly imposing an ideological framework onto coverage based on the perspective and priorities of the American left. Journalists surely should look at any specific issue that seems newsworthy and use their professional judgment as to what are the key dynamics of the story. The insistence by ideologues that environmental justice is the answer before you even know the question, that's not about the science and it's not about journalism. Which isn't to say that the impact on certain communities is never the story. The point is it's dictated by the story, not overlaid onto every story regardless. 4. Ditch the beltway, he said, she said. I have no idea what that means. Let's read on. There are, of course, plenty of urgent climate stories to be told from halls of government. But when we treat the climate story first and foremost as a political dogfight, we give the narrative over to the same intractable partisanship that so degrades the rest of our political coverage. Okay, so they're saying don't always report the issue as a fight between political partisans. And that would be a fair point, if you hadn't already implied that the political viewpoint of one side of the divide should be given precedence in how the issue is reported. With the two together, it sounds like an excuse to push a political take on the issue while not having to report the opposite political perspective. By foregrounding partisanship in our climate coverage, We also risk losing huge swaths of audiences that likely feel they get more than enough political news as it is. Well, you probably run more risks of losing them because you're talking about climate when you're supposed to be talking about business and health and housing and education and food, etc., etc. And for those readers, viewers and listeners whose political views are ensconced in one camp or the other, we forego opportunities to challenge assumptions. Now, you see, there's a principle behind all that I support. If you could remove coverage of the science of the matter from the political polarisation, it would enable people to engage with it without triggering tribal affiliation stuff. And that would be good. The climate does not care about your politics. But again, you've promoted an explicitly political positioning for the issue. So that doesn't look like you're wanting to remove the non-political parts of an issue from a political partisan context. It looks like you're trying to sneak your perspective through, unchallenged by the people who disagree with it. A fine campaigning tactic. Once again, not what journalism's there for. 5. Avoid doom and gloom. We can and must understand the epochal consequences of climate change. If our coverage is always negative, however, it leaves the public with an overall sense of powerlessness, in the words of former NPR reporter Elizabeth Arnold. It just reaches this point where people feel hopeless and overwhelmed. I agree with this point, but not their framing. Their framing is that you should fine-tune how you talk about this in order to have the desired motivational effect on the public. Again, that's a campaigner's consideration. But what the media constantly does, and what they don't apparently question as an issue here at all, is that it will report unlikely worst-case scenarios in headlines, giving the impression that such scenarios are likely or imminent. It's not to say you can never talk about such scenarios, but they should be in context alongside the more likely ones. To give you some sense of this, Carbon Brief recently published a graphic showing the top 10 climate papers last year ranked by news and social media attention. And then Roger Pielka Jr. added the information about which of those papers were based on assessments using the highly unlikely RCP 8.5 worst case scenario. 6 out of the 10 were based on RCP 8.5, a scenario that would require us not only to abandon every climate measure currently being undertaken, but also then to go hell for leather in expanding coal use. That is routinely being used as the basis for climate scare stories. Now, that, I would argue, is not representing the science accurately. Not that if you did, you'd be saying there's no issue here. But if you're saying you should avoid doom and gloom, which I agree because there's many positive things, maybe stop pretending that worst case scenarios represent, quote, the science. 6. Go easy on the jargon. Do you really have to point that out to journalists? 7. Beware of greenwashing. Companies around the world are waking up to public demands for eco-conscious business practices. Pledges to go green, however, often amount to little more than marketing campaigns that obscure unmitigated carbon footprints. So shun the stenography and cast a sceptical eye on grand promises of net zero or carbon negative emissions, especially from big name companies that have historically been a big part of the problem. The suggestion that big name companies are the problem rather than, the aggregate effect of all the consumers they serve, which is us, that again is an ideological and a polemical position, delivered by people utterly content with a view that their perspective on the world is the only possible perspective that makes sense to reasonable people. Suggesting journalists should look with scepticism at corporate claims, you can't argue with that, of course they should. Just as they should look with scepticism at the claims of environmental campaigners, for instance. Just as they should look with scepticism at the policy proposals of politicians, whichever side they fall down on, for instance. Just as they should look with scepticism at the papers produced by scientists, because some are more contentious than others and nothing that was the product of a human should be expected to be perfect. Nobody gets a free pass. Likewise, some companies are actually taking some more concrete action than any governments right now. So the fact that some environmentalists hate big corporations and generally often hate capitalism full stop, that is not the journalist's problem. It's your duty to aim to understand the world as it is, not as some people prefer to see it or indeed would prefer it to be. 8. Extreme weather stories are climate stories. Wrong. Now, you could have written extreme weather stories might be climate stories, while noting the extreme reluctance by most scientists to make individual attribution statements to such events. The news is awash in hurricanes, floods, unseasonable snow dumps, record heat waves and drought. They are not all due to climate change, but the increased frequency and intensity of such extreme weather certainly is. Yet much news coverage makes little or no mention of the climate connection, leaving audiences without context and unaware that humanity is already experiencing climate disruption. There's not much science in that. It does at least acknowledge that such events are not all due to climate change. The point is that such extreme events happen all the time and have always been the focus of news. Insisting that every time there's an extreme event you have to bang on about climate change again, I think that reflects the campaigning mindset of people who never tire of their obsession, not the journalist mindset, for whom an event like that is better likely to be focused on the impact it has on people, the success or failure of mitigation such as flood defences and the like. But also it's just wrong. Many of the things listed are not currently increasing in frequency. People often assume that they are because of recency bias and because they've now been trained to notice every time they do happen and to attach significance to them. Worse still, some coverage greets this bad news with cheer. An alarmingly unseasonable heat snap, for example, is a much welcome break from the cold. Because you're meant to suffer, do you understand? Don't go out on the beach and enjoy yourself. Cower at home and fear the bloody apocalypse. This is why people like this don't get invited to parties. I mean, okay, recently nobody's been invited to parties, but you know what I mean. Even within their own terms of reference, it doesn't make sense. If you want to persuade ordinary people of your point of view, insisting that they should be miserable about the things that make them happy, well, let's just say there's no evidence to support that that's an effective persuasion technique. 9. Jettison the outdated belief that climate coverage repels audiences and loses money. Climate stories have a bad reputation as low traffic ratings killers. This might have been true in the past, but demographic shifts and growing public awareness have brought increased demands for smart, creative climate coverage, especially from young audiences for whom the climate emergency is often top of mind. Indeed, there's good evidence that strong climate coverage can actually boost a news outlet's bottom line. Well, I would expect news outlets pay constant close attention to what content generates interest for them and what doesn't. So they probably don't require campaigners to give them advice based on what they wish they would cover more of. And of course, the problem is that the stories that do generate the most interest are exactly the ones that are slanted to the negative, the ones with the most capacity to shock or to scare people. If it bleeds, it leads. It's a well-known news principle, which is exactly why they so often cover the RCP 8.5 stories. Our problem is the business model of the media more than anything else. And the final item of these best practices. For God's sake, do not platform climate denialists. We understand as well as anyone that opinion pages occasionally need to push the envelope with unpopular takes. But there is no longer any good faith argument against climate science, and if one accepts the science, one also accepts the imperative for rapid, forceful action. Op-eds that detract from the scientific consensus or ridicule climate activism don't belong in a serious news outlet. And right there is the problem. First, certain people can never be platformed regardless of the story, regardless of their potential contribution. Even as opinion columnists, their opinion is not allowed to be heard. Honestly, that is such a despicable principle in the context of a free press. There are columnists who regularly provoke me to fury, and there are people who occasionally observe that I do the same to them. That's the value and the cost of a free press in a free society. Right there you see the insidious domino pushing of this argument. And it's the argument behind this partnership and its website generally. No longer any good faith argument against climate science. Well, there is no one thing called climate science. It's a field of science. There are certain facts that we hold to be pretty well known, and then there are a bunch of likelies and a bunch of wholly unknowns, and those are the subject of exploration and often vigorous debate. So you can't just say, oh, there's no argument about the science. Science is a process of argument and exploration and proof finding. But no, it's not because As it then says, if one accepts the science, one also accepts the imperative for rapid, forceful action. Not only that, op-eds that ridicule climate activism don't belong in a serious news outlet. And now we have it. So climate activists may block roads, causing ambulances to fail to get to their people in time of urgent crisis. Climate activists may push for zero carbon emissions by 2025, a solution that is practically impossible and which they can't even articulate how they would ever go about meeting it. Climate activists may literally stand in front of children and tell them that because of climate change they won't get to grow up. But ridiculing climate activism doesn't belong in a serious journalistic outlet. Well, I'm sorry, but no. If you say you're following the science while ignoring the science, if you're doing stupid and counterproductive things like trying to stop the commuters of Canning Town tube station from getting to work, if you're going onto programmes and claiming that 6 billion people are going to die because you read a news story and there was a typo in it, which is what Roger Hallam did, you deserve critical scrutiny at best and ridicule as well. Nobody gets a free pass. Not them, not me, not Joe Biden, not Greta Thunberg, not outlier scientists like Kevin Anderson, not sceptical critics such as Judith Curry. All voices get heard, all actions are open to scrutiny and are open to criticism. The citizens of countries where that's not how it works have significant problems to worry about unrelated to climate change. Because traditionally they spend their time trying to get past the firewalls, trying to hear critical voices so that they have some chance of learning what is the truth in the world. Anyway, that's their list. I find it somewhat problematic, as you will have gathered. If I were to do my version of advice to science journalists, it would go along these lines. Report what is interesting and important, not just what is fashionable. Make science fascinating, not frightening, because people do find science engaging. It's lazy to think you can only attract their attention by top slicing the extreme top end of a range of scenarios. Give all political perspectives equal scrutiny. The very core science may be solid. Everything else is subject to uncertainty, and the question of what we do about it especially has to be subjected to scrutiny, because that's how democracy works. Remember, power should be held to account. If you're not doing that, what's the point of you? Aim to ensure your readers are well informed and therefore able to make their own judgment. Don't see it as your job to nudge them into a particular way of seeing the world. And finally, if there are things that you refuse to cover because their implications don't suit your particular narrative, then you're not doing journalism, you're doing campaigning. If you're sitting in a mainstream outlet and you're knowingly subverting the mechanisms so that you can promote your campaigning message, you're undermining, not advancing your profession. So, that's my take on it. Let me know what you think in the comments below.